Ladies and gentlemen, some Nvidia RTX 50 benchmarks have actually leaked online, and this is actually from a quite intriguing source. It is actually from Micron, which of course are one of Nvidia's memory partners going into the RTX 50 generation. And these performance estimates are rather interesting to say the least. So we're going to be talking about that, plus some updates to the release date for both Blackwell and RDNA 4, right after this quick message from the sponsor of the video. If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by whokeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out whokeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices. Now, I'm sure most of you know that there are two essentially memory variants which are being used by higher end graphics cards right now. We're looking at R6 and R6X. And obviously going into the next generation, GPUs such as Blackwell will make the switch from GDDR6 to R7. And it will bring with it the usual improvements. It will of course have, well, just faster memory speeds, which is obviously good for bandwidth, but another big update seems to be the support for larger capacity memory modules. So this means that 2 as well as 3 GB modules should be achievable, and that could make some interesting decisions for narrower memory buses in the lower to mid range. So that's going to be exciting, right? Having a 96-bit bus. Am I right? Aren't you just itching for just joy? Anyway, sarcasm aside, Micron have basically released a slide that seems to offer some performance projections for Blackwell. Now, there are some caveats here, but I think it's important for us to look at the performance numbers first, and then we can start to talk about the caveats, because obviously it's going to put things into much better context. So I initially spotted this on Twitter, courtesy of 3D Center, so I'll of course leave a link to that in the video description, but let's just begin. So there are 3 distinctive slides here, and what it seems to be, because they're stating R6, R6X, and finally R7. Now, what does that mean? Is that like RTX 30, 40 and 50 or what? Well, most likely this is in reference to the 7900 XTX, the RTX 4090, and presumably some configuration of a 5090. Again, we'll talk about the caveats in just a second. Now, you can see that, again, there are multiple resolutions and 2 variants of benchmarks. So there's both ray tracing and rasterization. So I'll focus on the 4K here just for a second. We can see that going from a 4090 to a presumably 5090, we're looking at 2.1 to 3.1. And in rasterization, it goes from 1.2 to, of course, a 1.5. Now, 3D Center have also done a quite nice comparison for this. I'm not going to read out all of it, but of course you can see on screen, or you can pause the video, or you can check out their tweets. But basically, depending on the resolution, of course, the higher the resolution, the more load on the GPU, and the less on the CPU, as I'm sure most of you know. But when it comes to rasterization, we're looking at just over a 40% improvement, but with ray tracing, it's just over a 50% improvement. Now, there are a couple of caveats here. The first caveat is it may not be the Blackwell series that they are referring to. However, it's really the only generation of graphics cards that this could be at this point. So I don't think it could be anything else. I think it's very likely that this is true. This is Blackwell. The biggest caveat, however, is that we are not exactly certain of the configuration which is being tested. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, GB202 and of course other GPUs like GB203, or going back, multiple generations, Nvidia basically carved down the GPU as required. So it would shave down the number of SMs or memory bus and so on and so forth. So it's very possible that we are looking at 2 scenarios here. The first is a full chip versus a full chip. So the full 202 versus AD102, for example. Another potential possibility is that we are looking at an RTX 5090, all right. However, it is a configuration that may have changed. Now, it seems that Nvidia are playing around right now with different configurations of Blackwell. And early reports of the 5090 was it was going to have the full accompaniment of 512-bit bus. But more recently, it seems that this is being carved down to just 448-bit, which is obviously, well, a nerf. Now, how memory bandwidth starved Blackwell is, your guess is as good as mine on that one, because clearly we don't exactly know the full architecture, what's going on with the L2 cache, and so on and so forth. I've heard it's 96 megabytes, but again, is that the full complement of cache, or was that information even right? The second point is that the SM number may have changed. Micron may have older information in the slide, and therefore the final retail configuration changes, or things like driver improvements could also occur. Now, for what it's worth, I was hearing around 160 SM was the original target, around as in like, you know, a little bit more perhaps, but around 160 SM for the 5090, but now it seems to be 512, I wish, 144. Now, again, that's very possibly incorrect because Nvidia tests out so many different configurations internally, they iterate this stuff so fast that by the time we get a leak, it could be several weeks old. And this is going to be very interesting. However, most of my sources do tell me that we're looking at least a 50% improvement from one generation to another, so I wouldn't be surprised. Most of the performance improvements I suspect for Blackwell are going to be things like DLSS, and it's going to be very interesting to see how Nvidia actually pushes us forward. Do I think that these are educated guesses? Probably. I'm going to be very curious to see how Blackwell actually performs against the previous generation. It seems that my RTX 5080, for example, the SM number that was commonly being bandied around was 96? But now GB203 has basically been nerfed, cut, and it seems that it's only 84 SM. So it's going to be very interesting to see actually how all of this shapes up. And speaking of just very conflicting information, let's move on to the release dates, shall we, of both RDNA 4 and Blackwell. We'll keep on the Blackwell train for just a moment longer, so keep your tickets handy. But basically, when it comes to Blackwell, the general consensus has been that later this year, around Q3, late Q3, we're going to see Nvidia host a conference, and Jensen's going to come out with his famous leather jacket and is going to tell us, of course, about the new GPUs. It was never obviously going to be announced at Computex because there was just no way, there's just not been enough information from board partners at this point, so it always seemed like it was going to be later on in the year. And the release date, of course, was going to be, let's say, November-ish or October-ish. There were some reports, I can't remember the source on Twitter, but I'm sure it'll pop up on screen, and someone was stating that actually it's now been moved to Q1. And others were saying on Twitter that this is not the case. I reached out to my sources, and the sources I've spoken to basically at the time, and I made a video about this, saying, nope, nothing has changed, it's still Q4. Interestingly, Hassan from WCCFTech was at Computex, and obviously Nvidia does speak to, well, partners. Interestingly, he was speaking to them about the desktop parts, because clearly mobile and desktop can have different release dates. Typically, mobile parts do have a staggered release date versus the desktop, not always, but generally. And he basically got the 50-50 answer. He spoke to 8 different people, 4 of them told him, this year, and then the other 4 told him next year. And he was very abundantly clear, allegedly, and he essentially said, well, are you sure? Yup. I've reached out to a couple of people again, and yeah, I pretty much got the same answer. People are telling me they believe it is this year. However, I've had one person tell me maybe Nvidia have changed it. I literally just got that message a few minutes ago, and I also had someone else tell me, well, we basically think they may have meant the financial year, which could mean Q1 in reality. So, I honestly don't know. If I had to guess, And this is a guess, because again, Hassan's sources are telling him one thing, my sources are telling me 50-50. I'm sure we're going to get something solid pretty soon. AGF on Twitter has also been pretty damn reliable. He's saying this year. So I personally think it's quite likely it's still going to be this year. You can make a good argument that Nvidia are typically very clockwork when it comes to GPU releases, and it would have been a minute before, of course, they released the previous generation. It's almost 2 years ago now, so that would make sense. However, you could also play as devil's advocate, which is always fun to do, and you could say, well, why would they release it? Because RDNA 4, even if it released this second, which it won't, but let's just say it did release tomorrow, RDNA 4 is not going to be as performant as the 5080. Depending on how the chips may fall, if you excuse the pun, it could be around the 5060, the 5070. Again, depending on driver updates, what specifications Nvidia decide to grace us with, and of course how accurate the performance leaks regarding RDNA 4 have been. So yeah, I mean, it could just be a case of Nvidia just want to throw as many of the high-end chips as possible towards data center AI and so on, or they could have another reason. Who knows? It could also just be an overabundance of supply in the 4090s or what have you. Again, it's very difficult to say. Now, speaking of RDNA 4, before Computex, I released a couple of videos to say, yeah guys, I don't think RDNA 4 is going to be this year. And it definitely won't be at Computex. Lo and behold, obviously, it was not at Computex. I am quite intrigued because now Hassan is, again, from WCCFTech, was speaking to board partners, and they are basically telling him it seems that it is not going to be this year. I will be very interested if AMD does release RDNA 4 this year, because there have been a lot of updates in the Linux drivers and the software, so it's not like there aren't signs of release, and I've heard that the hardware is coming on very well. So the main reason I've heard, and it could be completely wrong, is basically they just don't have a reason to release it at the moment because there are just so many RDNA 3 GPUs in the supply chain, and it is doing better. I've also heard some rumors that there's going to be like some type of bundle happening in the future for, I can't remember if it's N31 or 32 GPUs. This is from off the cuff, but either way, certain GPUs are going to get like a kind of a better game bundle towards the latter part of the year. We'll wait and see if that's true. However, I will be very curious to see what happens with this. Speaking of, and just last thing before I bugger off, there are a lot of reports at the moment, obviously, for the Zen 5 benchmarks and everything else that have obviously been the official results, which is like 16% from AMD. There are some test chips that are now kind of circulating online. You can see some results from the various APUs. It's going to be very interesting because, AMD, I think it was like Zen 4, the early IPC numbers that AMD released were like 8%, but then the servers were somewhere like 12 or 13%. So I'm just gonna wait and see, like, for the results. It's gonna be very interesting to see what happens with Zen 5. The benchmarks that I've seen are just all over the place, even the official numbers. It's like some of them are 35%, in others it's obviously much less. So I'll be very curious to see what independent results we get for both Turin as well as Granite Ridge. It's going to be very interesting to see how all of this shapes up. I'm going to be very curious how it also compares against Intel. There is a lot of stuff that has actually been, of course, announced with Intel at the moment. So I'm going to be doing a video probably the next day or so, because I've talked about a lot of really cool stuff actually regarding Battle Mage. So I think that's just about it for this particular video. Sorry if I'm looking like I'm sweating a bit. I am. It's really hot in this office and I've had to close up all the windows and stuff because noise outside. So I'm going to be very happy to be able to open them again. Take care of yourselves, guys. Stay safe. Bye for now.